Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth event in the Equality Bahamas series of events for 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We are really happy that you joined us today, and we hope to see you at even more events that we'll tell you more about towards the end. But for right now, we are having a conversation for and with men. Now, this whole thing is about gender-based violence against women, against LGBTQI plus people and other people in situations of vulnerability. So over the last few days, we've really been focusing on women and our experiences with violence. And every time we have a conversation about women and girls, somebody comes in to say, what about the men? What about the boys? Why are we always talking about the women and the girls? Well, we're talking about women and girls because we are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, and we experience high rates of gender-based violence. Men and boys do need to be a part of the conversation, of course, because they experience other kinds of violence, and we actually need them to help us to end gender-based violence because a lot of the issue is rooted in misogyny, in hyper masculinity, toxic masculinity, not masculinity itself, but our speakers today will talk a little bit more about that. And in this conversation, they'll be able to talk about their own experiences, their own thoughts about all of these issues, the systems that all of this violence is rooted in, how they see themselves in the landscape, and what they think needs to be done to move us forward. We have with us Todd Sargent from the US Embassy in Nassau, who will be facilitating this conversation. So Team Equality Bahamas will be able to step out of the screen of this, the situation, and the women will be in the background watching the chat, helping to engage you all. If you have any technical issues, please let Nia or me know, and we will help you out using the chat. Passing over to you now, Todd.
Thank you, Alicia. I want to thank you, Alicia, for the invitation. You are someone who I respect and who I have learned so much from just in talking with you and also from your columns. And I very much appreciate you and all that you do with Equality Bahamas. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of Equality Bahamas 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. You've expertly organized a series of important discussions, including tonight's conversation on the role of men in preventing gender-based violence. From my 2+ years in the Bahamas, I have become increasingly aware of the severity of gender-based violence in the Bahamas. But to be fair, it's a global issue. The statistics and stories in my home, the United States, show that we all have a long way to go to ending gender-based violence. And I think you're right to include this conversation. We often focus on women, but as you pointed out a moment ago, men must be part of the broader conversation. So thanks, and without further ado, we'll jump right in. I do want to have the panelists quickly introduce themselves. Stephen Thompson, why don't you go first? Introduce yourself, please.
Hey, Todd. Good evening, good night, good day, everyone. So my name is Stephen Thompson. By trade, I'm a clinical forensic psychologist. A lot of the work that I do is around mental health, community mental health, providing counseling and psychotherapy to men, women, and children. So that's a little bit about me. I am located in Eleuthera, but I am originally from Nassau, Bahamas.
Thank you, Stephen. And now Dominic Duncombe.
Hi. I am a photographer and sometimes writer. I was born and grew up in New Providence, and I've worked at 2 of the papers here, and I've spent a lot of time dealing with gender issues here, both as a reporter writing about some of the stories and covering stories here, and just in day-to-day life. So I'm hoping to contribute and learn a lot from this experience.
All right, thank you very much. And last but not least, Lavetanalagi Seru, over to you.
Thank you, Todd. My name is Lavetanalagi, and I'm joining you from Fiji. For those who don't know, that's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I'm a climate activist, and I work for the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, which is a regional umbrella body for civil society organizations that are working on climate justice issues in the Pacific. And I've worked a bit in my previous work on gender and human rights, including working with persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities and expression. It's a pleasure to join you all this morning, and good evening and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Langi. And thanks to all three of you. So let's jump right in. I have a series of questions to pose to you. And the last question is more action oriented. So I certainly want to make sure that we save enough time for the last one. But let's start off. How would you define gender-based violence? And I'll open that up to any of the three of you who'd like to start.
So Todd, when we look at gender-based violence, it essentially is violence that is impacted by someone just particularly based on their gender or their gender roles. So when we're talking about violence against women, we're specifically talking about women and their roles or their roles in society and how we see them, and then violence as a result of that, or through the capacity of engaging in being a woman or being a girl in society. So for the short part of it, essentially it's just violence against them. Now there are different types of gender-based violence, but I would love to be able to hand it off to one of my panel folks to answer that question as well.
Thank you. Anyone want to?
I'm not really going to get any more thorough than that. I just wanted to say that that was what I was going to say, but better.
Thank you. Yeah, from my end, Stephen, I think have articulately defined what gender-based violence is, but most in the context of the Pacific, pre-colonial, gender has been fluid. And that's something I want to bring into this discussion, that before we were colonized by the US, the British, the French, we had third gender identities that existed in the Pacific, and as a result of our colonial history has been wiped away. And so when we look at, and the Pacific has one of the most highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. When we look at some of these vulnerable groups, such as the LGBTQI or persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, they are specifically targeted through acts of violence, through discrimination and stigma based on their gender identities. And so this is one of the work that's ongoing here in Fiji in the Pacific, is to bring that conversation back and say, pre-colonial time, this has been one of the identities that has existed in our cultures, and in countries like Samoa and Tonga, they're well accepted, whilst other countries like in Fiji, who have become very conservative Christian societies, they certain to some extent some pushback, specifically based on these gender identities and expressions of community members. Yeah, so that's probably my input into that. Its gender is very diverse, it's very fluid. And people
sorry, go ahead. No, so I wanted to add to that, and I think it's important, especially when we talk about Lagi is in Fiji, and a lot of our audience may be in the Bahamas, but when we talk about gender, we have to be mindful that gender is essentially a social construct, and this idea that the various different rituals and customs and different things that we accept and understand of how we view women or view men or however are very much defined and held and sustained because of the culture. So when we look at how we see men and women and children in the Bahamas, for example, it may be totally different in a whole different country. There may be different things that are more acceptable or not acceptable in Fiji, even in America, in the US. There's a lot of different things that kind of create this definition of what we see as a man or what we see as a woman or any of the various genders that exist. And so I think it's important that we also provide some depth to that as we look at exploring gender-based violence, and particularly with Lagni's point about it's really a result of persons existing in that gender identity and experiencing violence because of that.
Excellent. Thanks to the three of you for getting us off to a good start so that we have a sort of a common understanding of what gender-based violence is. For those who are watching this event live, feel free to enter your comments into the chat. And we want this to be an engaging conversation. We want to include you as well. I am going to move on to the next question. Why is this a men's issue? So I'll open that up to any of the three of you who would like to start.
So Todd, there are a lot of reasons why this is a men's issue, but first we need to articulate that this is also a men's issue. So just kind of right up the gate that this is a men's issue. Now, why it is a men's issue? I mean, we all know children, we all know girls, we all know we come from mothers. We have to be mindful that these are people in our communities, people that we engage with, people that may be next door. And as men, we hold the power in our societies. We hold the positions that can, infect or affect change and affect policies. And so we have to be mindful of the places in which we are and how these laws and policies then impact our fellow country persons, our fellow, the people that go to church with us, that go to the food stores with us. We have to be mindful of the laws that we are empowered to create or to dismiss that will be able to protect those people. And so really my point of view is really that, we have the power in our societies to make the change. And if we are aware of it and knowledgeable of it, it's the only way we can essentially save and protect, support, the dismantling of the systems that do support and create gender-based violence in our countries.
Yeah, to add on to what Stephen had talked about, Fiji and many of the Pacific Island cultures are built around this patriarchal society, where men are the leaders within their households and also within the broader community. Men take up leadership roles within faith-based institutions, which really they wield such a powerful influence in affecting behaviors and attitudes of society, and because of that, women tend to be seen at a at a subservient level. Women and girls, they're made to cook and wash, and even in when we have meetings, you don't really often see women in that decision-making spaces. Just last week, we were in a community doing a training, and these were young, we invited young people, but we saw about 2 or 3, young women coming in and sitting, and we asked where the rest were, and they said, they're out in, they're in the kitchen, they're cooking, preparing meals for yourself. And they said, oh, the whole idea here is to bring women into this space as well. So that's how our society has been built and has been, shaped by some of the colonial, laws and systems. And that's something that we are slowly trying to, to change. But circling back, so we see this as a men's issue because men, are in, seats of, influence, power, seats of power and influence. They're able to effect change. But also most of the gender-based violence cases that are being reported in the Pacific are, where men are actually the perpetrators. So it is as much, as what Stephen had said, it's men who are, who'll be able to solve this issue. But I don't want to discount the fact that there are also men who are subject to, gender-based violence because of, we haven't created as a society the kind of conducive environment where men will be able to openly talk about, things like their emotions, talk about their mental health. So, because this is where most of their problems, they're bottling it up and they're not sharing it. And as a result, when they, we say, they have this very short fuse. So, something goes wrong or something isn't done in a way that they intend that, it should be done, then, punches, they throw punches or, a few kicks. So this is where men come in. It's a men's issue because they're central to addressing this issue. And they're central to, the strategies and the solutions to address gender-based violence.
Thank you, Langi.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that as well, I think we have to be mindful that a lot of times when we talk about gender-based violence, some men or some people may come in and say, what about violence against men? And yes, gender-based violence happens against men, but we have to be mindful that disproportionately this happens against women and girls. What we see is the more violent acts of domestic violence are happening against women and girls. And we have to be mindful of that. We're not discrediting that, violence doesn't happen to men, but because of, when we look at the data, when we look at, the instances, when we look at the things that are essentially sensationalized, a lot of times it is, the violence against women and girls. And to even further elaborate on kind of the definition of gender-based violence, it's not just, what we see in the media, punches and that physical stuff, but there are also a lot of other things such as, withholding money from women and children, withholding food and starving them, withholding them in terms of, monitoring them in such a way that they cannot move about freely, psychologically abusing them, emotionally abusing them. And so we have to be mindful that, it's not just the violence that, that shows a scar, that shows blood or that draws blood. It really is some of these other things that take place in the home or wherever have you that really create detrimental instances for women and girls.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the next question, Dominic, I'm going to start with you. Given that you've worked in media, reporter and photographer, so you've sort of followed news events, and so the question is, why do we center women in the conversation about gender-based violence? What do you see? What have you seen in your work that you've done? That might answer this question for us. Why is it so often women that are in the center of this conversation about gender-based violence?
Well, I would say that the short answer is because it disproportionately affects women. I mean, that's just the data. And I would argue that they're not centered enough in so many conversations, which is part of the problem, which kind of touches back on why is this a men's issue? It's not, it's a human issue. And when people say that, what about men? It's like, okay, what about them? Like we can have both conversations at the same time. It's not one or the other, and framing it as a binary is missing the whole point. Like we have really bad ideas about gender in so many ways, and we start where the biggest problems are, I think. And there's a lot of clear and evidence and a long history of evidence that we have really bad ideas that manifest disproportionately towards women. And the way that men react to even the suggestion of that really tells you everything you need to know about the issue and why it needs to be talked about in the way that it is. Like just the idea that someone asking like, why aren't we talking about men? It's just, I really have to question whether it's worth the time to get into those kinds of bad faith arguments anymore, because very rarely are people asking that because they have any understanding of the data or the history connected to that question. They're really just saying, I don't want to talk about women's issues and I don't want to change my behavior and I don't want to think about things that are hard for me to think about. And you can go so far with that conversation, but there's a lot of people who are genuinely interested in better ideas about gender that you can spend time on. And I mean, just in terms of this issue, like when you're talking to people, there's so many examples from our own lives that make it very clear why we need to center women and start with women in this conversation. But they're connected. It's not like you can just talk about women. Like in the course of talking about issues that are affecting women, men are there because that's the other side of it. That's who's benefiting from the lopsided arrangement. So they come up at the same time. And like, if we can't get past those boundaries and those basic obstacles that disingenuous and bad faith actors are putting there, like we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you. Stephen or Longy, anything to add to that? Why we center women in the conversation about gender-based violence?
Well, I think Dominic really hit the nail on the head. I mean, it impacts women disproportionately, obviously, but also I think there's almost an expectation when we see things like gender-based violence happen against women, because it's almost so normalized that it does happen because of some of the gender roles that we have in our societies. For example, even when we think of, in a marriage, women are the property of men and different things like that. And so when we center women, and we have to center women because they're the ones being most impacted, but they are also the ones that have little to no say on how to get out of it, right? Or how to change the policy. So it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the idea that so many men are in spaces to, effect change and meaningful change, and women are not in those spaces. And so we have to give voice to the voiceless. And that's why we have to center women in this conversation, because it is them that is being the most impacted, and it's them that has the least amount of influence on, getting rid of the problem or getting themselves. We're trying to have the victims pull themselves out of it, but we have to, support the dismantling of the systems that put the victims in there in the first place.
I just want to add into that conversation that the question is not why do we center women, because the data, even from the Pacific, has spoken to that and showed us that women are the ones that are experiencing more gender-based violence. I think up to 80 to 85%. But the question is, how do we center women? In the conversation about gender-based violence, and how do we create the kind of safe spaces, even within homes, where we are, inculcating the kind of values to our, to the children, teaching them about, gender roles and responsibilities, simple things, like washing dishes is not, a woman's role or young girl's role only. It's also for men. Same goes for cooking and washing and hanging out clothes, etc. Because most of the the disagreements and the kind of things that creates violence and abuses has been because women can't cook when men come back from work, and the woman haven't cooked, although she's they're also working mothers. They have kids to also look after. Women are unable, haven't done this, and so it's specific to the roles that they've done. And so we need to also begin to unpack that conversation within our own families and our own communities, and then bringing women, who are victims to gender-based violence at the center, and giving them a space to also talk about some of the challenges. There was a research that was done by a number of civil society organizations here in Fiji around unpaid care work. And it's just mind-blowing how much unpaid care work that women do that we do not sort of place a value on. And so, men go to work and they come back expecting things to be, clean and tidy in the household when you have about 5 or 6 kids running around, food cooked, everything, washed and clean. And so when they come back home and that's not done, they don't realize how much effort and time it takes women to do things like even collecting water. It takes them, an average between 40 to 1 hour collecting water and washing, and so they're unable to do other sets of work. And so these all conversation are useful, and giving that space to women to talk about some of the challenges in their daily life, so men can realize just how much women are doing, and young women are doing and contributing back to their own families and society, and be able to find ways between them to come up with solution or strategies on how they can best support each other, because that's what we've seen. Most of the arguments, the violence has been because women haven't done this, women haven't done that. The young girl hasn't cleaned the clothes or washed the dishes, etc. So yeah, those conversation need to start right from the household, while at the same time we are also looking at policy reforms and legislative reforms to protect women within, even within their own families and within their own communities. Fiji has, ratified conventions such as CEDAW. Fiji has one of the progressive constitution when it comes to the protection of persons of diverse SOGS, sexual, LGBTQI. There's a section on our constitution that protects them from any form of discrimination. But if you go to communities, it's totally the opposite that's happening. Violence is still happening, discrimination is still happening. It's because we haven't coherently, made sure that the policy are translating to practice on the ground, and that the system and structures, including police services, the health services, are up to par and aligned and are built to ensure that the protection of these people, the LGBTQI women and girls, are sort of like prioritized. So that's that's what I wanted to add further to that question.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Alicia, for translating some of the terms for us, for those of us who may not know them. So appreciate that. Yeah, you've both, you've touched on a lot of issues, and you got into a little bit of, Talangi, you got into a little bit of, what can we be doing to address the issue, and we'll come to that in a moment. You talked about having policies in place, but then there's the enforcement of those policies. There was a headline locally in the Bahamian news today. Correct me, those of you who know the headline better than me. I don't have it in front of me, but it was something like 2/3 of sexual crimes, sexual violence, sexual assault are, I think, unreported. And I think this is really concerning. But even if they are, there's we need our enforcement mechanism, law enforcement, to take those claims seriously and pursue justice. So, but let's move on to the next question, which is, how are men affected by gender-based violence? And how is that impacted by patriarchy, misogyny, and heterosexism?
I'll go first because I'll probably have the shortest, most general answer, if that's cool. But what's interesting to me about this is, especially here, how much gender affects pretty much every aspect of men's lives. I mean, everyone's lives, but men spend so much time here thinking about their connection to women, their relationship with women, whether it's their mothers or their family or their girlfriends, in such limited, objectifying ways that limits their own identities. There's such strange things, like they will share so much more with their male friends than their intimate partners. You know, it's nothing, like they will tell them the secrets that they won't share at home, you know, sharing sexual exploits and things like that without being honest with their own partners and building like a mature relationship with someone. They're terrified of feeling anything, and just so many of like their whole identity is based around this weird idea of maleness that they don't even fully understand themselves or believe in. Like so many conversations are just men sitting around like posturing for each other with no, like, just echoing each other's bad ideas and no real sense of identity. And so many limiting ideas of gender because like we're terrified of not being accepted, and just, you know, whether it's homes or like the community that reinforces these bad ideas because it's easier than having the tough conversations or being yourself. And so like it's the patriarchy reinforces these ideas because it's easier to go along with them than fight, and you're rewarded for going along with them. That's what the patriarchy is being rewarded for being more male. Misogyny and heterosexism, like, I challenge you to find an insult, especially one that's more colloquial, that is not just "you're a woman." And look at our vocabulary here and in a lot of places. The entire vocabulary of insults is "you're a woman, you're a girl, you're soft like a woman," and vilifying all these characteristics that we have ascribed to femininity. And by that, you know, just the last thing I'll say connected to that is all our words related to sex are violent and aggressive, slamming, you know, like just every single example you can come to is forceful and not a shared intimacy, but like a taking. And it's so limiting to our relationships and our identity that it's how is it not affected? Like it affects every single waking moment of men's lives. And the fact that they don't want to talk about it or think about it is central to so many problems we have.
Thank you, Dominic.
Yeah, Dominic, and that's something that we have to really, you know, continue to interrogate, right? Because when we think of how men are impacted by gender-based violence and patriarchy, misogyny, heterosexism, so there's this concept that you spoke on, but for those that may want to go and look into it a lot more deeper, is this concept called hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is essentially the dominant form of masculinity in a particular culture. It's also referred to as the man box. And essentially, it's the idea that there are particular characteristics that we look at within a particular society that lets us know that this person is a man, right? That lets us know this person is a man because they are heterosexual, because they are a leader, because they are sexual, because they're able to acquire women, because they're able to do all of these things, you know, these different aspects that we deem as being manly, being a guy's guy or whatever have you. But they create this kind of box that all men and boys do whatever they can to whatever extent to fit into this box, right? If they're in this society that kind of prioritizes, as a result of patriarchy and misogyny, prioritizes those traits, you know, being tough, being brave, being successful, having a deep voice, like all of these different things as it relates to your society. Now, when we think of some of those violations that, you know, essentially, if you don't fit into this box, into the man box, then you're seen as, you know, homosexual, you're seen as soft, you're seen as being a sissy, you're seen as being a girl, you're seen as all of these other things because you don't fit into this box, right? And as humans and kind of just society in general, we got to label it. We everyone is so stuck in this binary. You're either in this box, you're a man, or you're some other characteristic that is not manly. And I think because of, what also happens is as a result of trying to be in this box and fighting to stay in this box, whether it's posturing, like Dominic said, to your friends, or even to other women that you may be interested in, or just for the sake of, posturing, what we see happen is there are some social ills that come about because you're trying to maintain this box, because you're trying to maintain the status quo, what it means to be a man. And that results in engaging in, abuse of substances to manage your emotions, because you're supposed to be stoic. You're supposed to hold your emotions in as a man. And so in order to manage those emotions or cope with those emotions, you drink, right? Or you engage in being promiscuous in sexual conquest, or you engage in some of these, so much of these other things that we refer to as toxic masculinity, that essentially result in you engaging in behaviors because you don't know how to express yourself, because you're not supposed to express yourself because you're a man, right? Because you're not supposed to talk about your feelings because you're a man. And then you end up you're drinking, and we know what happens when people drink and they have feelings bottled up. And then it's just one thing leads to the next. And that's a lot of times how we see, gender-based violence occurs. A lot of times, based on the statistics that I'm aware of, a lot of persons are under the influence because they were trying to deal with something else. They were trying to cope with something else, cope with their feelings. And then they end up home and they see the dishes aren't done or the laundry isn't done. And then we have a whole situation there. And so that's really how it impacts men, how men are affected by it because of this idea of trying to stay in this, be manly, and these other things that we do to stay manly. It results in just creating, maladaptive situations that we're then engaging in violence, and kind of anyone that's around that person becomes a victim essentially.
Thank you, Stephen.
I just wanted to add on, and I think I believe that Stephen and Dominic had covered most of what needs to be covered for that question. But and this is just an observation, and these are all things that are learned, and they, these are really learned at a very young age. And I've observed that it's how parents have raised up their kids. Some of them, much more progressive modern families, I've seen them, very, shared responsibilities and roles for their kids. But if I go back to the village, I still see young women and girls being asked to go and cook food, and the man, has to go out to the farm, and the women are asked to go to, fishing and all that. And so even things like, the bullying, that's the manifestation that's happening in schools. That's a manifestation of what kids are being, are being taught and shown within society. And it also, media and, internet and video games has a part to play in that, because they all learn that violence, they all learn that those acts of abuses from what they're observing from their parents, from TV, social media, etc. So I think that's where we really need to also concentrate, is with our kids. And at a very young, tender age, we need to tell them that, the world is so diverse. The world is, shared between men, women, and other gender non-conforming people, and we should, respect that, and we should embrace that. And that patriarchal idea that, or that system, patriarchy system that continues to promote that, no, men will always be leaders and women will always be followers, is outdated. And it goes again to our values. And so in some of the work that we've been doing, we've been working with churches, faith-based institutions, to look at some of the cultural values and the traditional values that we can draw from, and then tell people, within our own traditions and cultures, we have this culture of respect for one another, culture of caring for one another. So any acts of violence, any acts of discrimination is not part of our culture. So that's one of the observation that we really need to look at, how our kids and children are being brought up, because most of what they're observing, they're manifesting. And so, even bottling up of emotions, when, a child, especially a young boy, cries, they're told, very instantly, you can't cry, you're the boy, you can't cry. Everyone's, people are watching you. So they grow up bottling up those, because that's all they've been taught in their life, is to bottle their emotions and not show it to the world. So that's just a short input from me. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing to that, because it really brought up something that I was thinking about, especially when we talk about our kids, right? And what they learn in school, what's reinforced, and what we kind of say girls and boys should do. I think about, being in primary school and boys picking on girls, and girls going to the teacher and complaining about this, oh, little Johnny is picking on me, tell him leave me alone. And 9 times, probably 10 times out of 10, and I'm sure those that are listening who may have been have seen this, a teacher's going to say, well, oh, Johnny just likes you. Just let go play with Johnny. Johnny just likes you. He's he's not doing any harm. But what are we telling that girl child? What are we telling that boy child? We're telling that girl child that when someone is showing affection, or when a boy is showing affection, it is in the form of picking on you, or being a little aggressive, or being a little mean. And what are we telling those boys? That this is an acceptable way to show your interest in a girl classmate. And so we have to be mindful to the extent of what we are reinforcing. Our kids are very in tune to what's going on, and they hold on to these values, like Lagni said, these messages and these things that we condone. And that's why we see, a lot of the challenges. Someone that doesn't just wake up one day and engage in some of these behaviors. It really is, a mixture of learning and what's being reinforced throughout your childhood, what's acceptable, what values and morals are held around you, and that's where we see a lot of the problems.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So I want to move on to the last question, which I think is the most important question, because it gets to what can we do to, and all three of you touched on this a little bit. But the question is, what do men need to do to end gender-based violence? And so I want to add a little bit to that question. I think about issues like climate change. We can think collectively. We can think about how can we change the system to address climate change? How can we do so from a policy standpoint? And then there's also, again, with climate change, there's also like, what can we personally be doing? To care for the environment. I think the same is true with a lot of issues, including gender-based violence. So what can we do from a macro perspective to, in terms of, fixing the system? And then what can we be doing personally in our homes and our relationships with our children to end gender-based violence? So maybe those are two ways to think about it. I'm going to start, as you think about how you'll answer this question. I do want to start with just an idea that I learned about. My sister worked for an organization for preventing child abuse, and part of her curriculum was studying a book. And maybe you're even familiar with this book, but it's a book about consent and about teaching consent to children. And it's done so in the context of tickling. I know I've got 3 children. We love to play Tickle Monster, but we have a rule in our house, and I learned it from this book, that as soon as somebody says stop, that's it. That stop means stop. It's not a joke. Stop. People aren't kidding when they say stop. It really means to stop. And so I try to enforce that in hopes, and of course my kids are still young, I don't know yet, but my hope is that lesson continues on, this lesson of consent and no means no, continues with them into adulthood. I have 2 boys and 1 girl. And so, and the 3 of you have mentioned children, and starting young and modeling gender roles, modeling the right behavior. So we've talked about gender roles, we've talked about power and influence. So we've already sort of set the table, I think, well, to start getting into this question of what do men need to do to end gender-based violence. So I'm gonna step aside and, oh, I see a note. What's the name of the book? I might be able to do a quick Google search and find it. I'll try to find it. And I see Alicia has posted one. That might be it. I'll take a look. But I do think that was a neat way to teach consent, is through tickling. No means no. And so anyway, I'll pass that on to the three of you to answer this question about how to end gender-based violence. So over to you.
Okay, I'll probably go first. So as we've, everyone, I guess, has mentioned this during this discussion, our society is built around, has been built around and been reinforced, reinforcing patriarchy. So we know that men are leaders, own most of the resources. And so the way, the solution, or on how do we see men, or what needs to do to end gender-based violence, is basically, one is to begin to share power. They hoard most of the power, and most of this power comes with responsibilities. Great power comes with great responsibilities, and because they begin, they take on all those power and responsibilities as the result of pressure, and the fact that they're unable to express themselves. It leads to many of these forms of gender-based violence. So I think men needs to begin to share power from their household level right through towards subnational, national, and also at the political level. In Fiji, 90% of our parliamentarians are men, are male. And so even within the subcommittees, there is not, so you have the Natural Resource Subcommittee, the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. We don't have, an equal representation of women in those key, decision-making tables. And so men need to begin to share power. They also need to create a safe space for women and girls to come into these spaces of power and be able to, articulate what their priorities are, what their demands are, what their issues are, and what are the opportunities in terms of working collectively to, address some of the social ills that we're experiencing. The other thing I see as men can do, since they are already in positions of power, is to look at the current laws and legislations and policies, and even at the community level, they have social rules, and see how these rules and regulations and legislations are restricting women's participation, or not ensuring those system and processes where women are able to bring their issues across. And when I say issues of domestic violence, issue of gender-based violence, issue of discrimination and stigma, because most of the time, women, have that are empowered to come on and report cases, but because of the systems are not well in place, most of the cases are still lying in files or are still unresolved. And so because of that, cases of sexual harassment and gender-based violence keeps on happening because no one is addressing it. And the systems and processes are not there to ensure that women's grievances and reports are being, taken into consideration, are being looked into, and that, the punishment are being, meted out for whoever the perpetrators are. So I think those were some of the three things that I wanted to share in terms of what men can do, noting that men have, already in positions of power. And I think those are some of the practical things that they're able to do.
Great, thank you.
All right. Yeah, I think Langi hit it got it exactly right. Like share power. I was gonna say, well, one of the habits men have been taught not to listen. We interrupt, we talk, we think ahead of what we're gonna say instead of just being in the moment and listening to the people who are being affected by things. Listen to the people who are dealing with the issue and give them what they need. You do not have better answers, and that includes sharing the power. It's not, to solve all our problems is really complicated and will take years and fine tuning. There are many problems that are simple and would be solved if the people who are being affected had the power. There are lots of laws and simple issues that we can get done in a week, but we don't move on them because the people who have the power are not affected by it and will do anything they can to avoid giving up any of their power at all. In terms of, and that the listening is I think is also for the micro and macro level, because around dinner tables, around this time of year at the holidays, you know what, when there are people talking around the family table, instead of saying, hey, I think we should do this, maybe make sure the women at the table are allowed to speak their minds and talk about what's affecting them, because they will have the best idea about what their problems are, better than we will. I learn every day that I have bad ideas about things, and that's, I'm going to keep learning that, I'm sure. So be quiet and make space for the people who are affected by these issues to talk. When it's just men, the way that I tend to get into people's space to make them think and maybe change their thinking about things is to show how these things affect them, how these things are hurting them. People usually have a lot of relationship complaints, whether that is they don't have a relationship, and so often this is connected to their bad ideas about gender and about themselves. And when you can say to them, this idea that you have about women, the way you're generalizing and objectifying and minimizing them and not thinking about them as individuals with individual choices and ideas, is probably getting in the way of your dating life. So maybe think about how you think about that. And you'll solve two problems at once, because you'll stop being a pain to all of society and your life will improve. And I think Langi's point about history is so important. We have this idea, so often people who want to go back to a simpler time have this romanticized idea of the male caveman. And it's colonialism has given us these very rigid, simplified, what's that wonderful word? But heterosexist idea that prioritizes these very limited relationships, and involving other genders and other binaries and other sexualities is part of humanity. And ignoring that and letting the bad ideas of colonialism continue, and thinking of maintaining that as a way of preserving traditions that are much older and much more robust and healthy and holistic is really depressing. So just sharing with people, hey, this isn't how we've always been. There have been many thousands of humans who've had better ideas about gender than this. We can use those ideas and not stick with these bad ideas, and we can have better lives as a result of it. Everybody can. I think that, that's how I try to reach people. But, the important thing is that we keep trying and having these kinds of discussions.
That's great. Thank you, Dominic.
Yeah, I think, Dominic and Lagi brought up some amazing points as it relates to how men and what men can do to end gender-based violence. I think something that is important is that men need to develop the empathy and capacity to understand that this is an issue, right? And that's through coming to talks like this, doing your own research, reading up, what is gender-based violence? What does gender-based violence look like? Like really develop the awareness for what it actually is. That's one of the first steps, I think, that, in order to combat it, you have to know what it is. And so being able to know the different types of gender-based violence, what that is and how those kind of impact you and your community is the first step. Develop awareness and build capacity for empathy, right? I think it's also important that men start to call other men out, call your friends out, call people out when you see them engaging in behaviors that are, misogynistic, heterosexist, or whatever, the locker room talk, the talk at the bar, call people out, don't allow persons to engage in these kind of harmful and violent kind of talking about women and children, that is actually how people feel, and it just kind of continues to perpetuate it being normalized. So call your friends out on, or the people that you hang out with. Be mindful that your silence is condoning that behavior, and kind of sit in the fact that, if you hear people even just having these kind of conversations, whether that's at the barbershop, at the bar, wherever you are, and obviously be mindful of your own safety, but be mindful that your silence is condoning what the conversation is being talked about. And so I think that is also very important. Another thing that men need to do is when we talk about women's rights, please stop bringing up men's rights. Like, please stop seeing it as though bringing up women's rights is taking away from men's rights. Like, that's, if anyone remembers anything, please remember that is not the issue. Like, that if someone brings up women's rights, it is not to the detriment of men's rights. And stop seeing it that way. Stop feeling as though it is that way. We are looking for equality and equity. We are not looking to take anything away from anybody, but we are trying to, like I said before, those that are voiceless, those that are being impacted by gender-based violence, we want to bring them up to where everyone else is as best suited for them. And so I think that is also very important as well. And then lastly, I would say, similar to what Lagi was saying, but really interrogate what are gender roles in your society and in your friend groups. What are they, and what are they to you? And what are the implications of upholding those gender roles and those different things in your spaces, and how they impact other people? So this whole thing on, I as man, or I have to be a man and whatnot, like, how does that, doing those things, impact other people? Do some self-reflection, shameless plug, go to therapy, go to counseling, unpack what's been going on in your childhood that leads you to hold these values and whatnot. But really, like, start to have the conversation with yourself, and then start to have the conversation with your friend groups, because until we really start to have this conversation and really have a informed conversation, right, a well-informed, well-rounded and educated conversation around what it is and what we need to do, it's just honestly going to continue happening the way that it's happening. And if we do, then we're just going to continue to see the cases that we see in the news and the cases that we don't see in the news, because the voices still remain to be voiceless.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen. You mentioned this, sometimes guys get together and are talking, and there's a comment that's made, and it's so easy to just laugh along, right? There's like a vibe, and it's part of you doesn't want to ruin that vibe or get serious when there's all this joking going on. And I know that for me personally, like, it's just easy. It's just easy to just laugh along, not say anything. But I'm sort of moving in the direction, and I'm starting to, like, when something maybe is said that's inappropriate, now I'm like not laughing along. Like, now I'm sort of like given a stare, which is silence. It's not ideal, but I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. I want to get to a place where I'm more comfortable, like, actually calling it out for what it is. And so it's hard to do, but it is necessary. I saw a really good video today on YouTube, just doing some research, and I forgot what it's called, but Alicia, you'll appreciate this because I'll holler back. But it's a video of men in their own way, encouraging other men not to do this, the catcalling on the street. I think it takes place in New York City, this PSA. It's pretty well done. But just trying to shoot it down and call it out and say, no, enough is enough. That's not appropriate. So I strive to get a little bit closer to that, to calling it out for someone like me who isn't generally confrontational. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, going back to children and teaching them, about gender roles and teaching them about what's right and wrong in terms of, to move toward preventing gender-based violence. I feel ideally it's parents, right, who are teaching their children the right way. I just feel like parents are so disparate. Parents, they have their own, every parent has a different idea about, gender roles. Everybody comes from a different background. Everyone has a different way that they want to teach their child. And so even though they should, I feel like I feel more comfortable with sort of like a more systemic approach, like schools, like instituting into their curriculum, and I'm sure there are schools that do this, ways to teach children about gender roles and consent and controlling anger in a way that's sort of consistent and hits every child. Because parents, if you leave it up to parents, I'm sorry, I just don't trust parents. And I don't know if the three panelists have a thought on, like, the role of schools in preventing gender-based violence and the roles of maybe other institutional bodies. But I'll turn it over to you in case you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Todd, I definitely agree. I mean, right, Alicia, I don't trust parents because, so here's the thing. I think what's going to be important when we talk about schools really is to the extent to which teachers and educators and school administrators have the capacity or the knowledge or the know-how as it relates to, how their own biases around gender and gender-based violence and whatnot impact how they engage with children. And so I think what needs to happen really is that there is professional development for our teachers, there's professional development for our administrators, focused on these topics, focused on, a family life, but that is contextualized through a gender equity lens, right? That looks at, creating spaces and understanding how you as a role model impact the children that are, in your schools, in your classrooms. How does how you show up impact how kids see how they should show up when they get older, right? And I think there needs to be a lot of that. You touched on a good point, which is, instituting a conflict resolution class or course from a young age, so kids understand how to manage their emotions when they're in conflict, when something doesn't go their way, when they're expecting something to happen. Because a lot of times, I mean, I'm sure you all know adults that don't have proper conflict resolution skills. But if we start at a young age at talking about conflict resolution, the importance of conflict resolution, regardless of who you're in conflict with, that if you focus on that and support either teachers being able to better manage conflicts, in their spaces, as well as to support their children or their students rather on how to better have stronger and better conflict resolution skills. And so I definitely think the schools and whatnot is definitely a space for us to kind of break down these aspects that kind of create and stir up gender-based violence and all of these other social ills. But I would definitely agree that it also starts, from the policies, because we need the ministers and persons in the political sphere to institute these laws and then hold persons accountable for them. Because it's one thing to put a law out there, and I've talked with Alicia about this before, but you put a law out there and then it's just out there, and we don't have the police officers or other persons, whoever is in charge, holding those laws or people accountable to those laws, but set up bodies that are able to hold this accountable, ensure that these courses that have, a gender equity lens in school are actually being taught properly, and ensure that, when there is violence against women, that we're not, pushing it to the side and saying, well, oh, I don't want to get in married people's business, or I don't want to, that's how it's supposed to be, or, this is what's just supposed to happen. And so we have to create more accountability throughout, from the household, from the school to the policy. And that really goes back to really developing the empathy and capacity to understand how gender-based violence impacts our society. Because if policymakers and government officials understand this, and kids understand this, and everyone understands this, then everyone is looking through this lens of how do my behaviors contribute to the social ill. And so I think that's what's going to be really important is, you talk about it more, you come to these sessions, you read about it, and it's going to be why once you may have someone that's in the 6th grade and they're learning about gender-based violence and, different policies and procedures or whatever have you, and the importance of gender equity and gender equality in schools, or engaging with people. And that might be the same person that becomes the next prime minister, or some other public official, but they have the foundation isn't set in this binary of what gender is. It's encompassing of something that isn't going to create more social ill. So I think that's where we really need to start and understand that if we don't have people that are really understanding what's going on and really giving it the weight that it deserves and it should have, then there's not going to be any change.
Thank you, Stephen.
I lost the thread for a second there. Sorry, I know exactly what I wanted to say until I clicked mute. Yes, sorry. Yes, I agree in terms of education, right? Here's the thing: we don't pay teachers enough. And interestingly, one of the tools we use to not pay teachers enough is gender. So full circle. So we're teaching the kids, don't value teachers, don't respect the teachers. So even if you have a great curriculum, of course they can't afford to teach it properly because they're underfunded. And they're worried about how they're going to pay for their health issues, especially when they're a woman teacher, because women's health issues are not even studied correctly, much less managed correctly. So it's this circle of very simple solutions to the problem, where the thing is, it is profitable to be misogynistic. It's profitable to be male. It's profitable to reinforce patriarchy, and so it is done. And until it is not, until it is cool to think about genders differently and to respect genders equally, we're gonna have this problem. It can't just be an enforcement, or people have to come to terms with the fact that it is a better life to include all genders and include each other. It's healthier for you and for society and for the life that you want. And yes, that definitely does have to come through schools. But one of the ways that would come through education and through these programs is just funding them and funding the people who are already trying to get sex ed taught properly in schools, to have mature conversations about so many of these issues. We know we've tread through a lot of this before. Again, if we're going to solve this problem 100% of the way, we could talk for many hours, but there are many issues that we know we're doing wrong, and we need to stop, and we need to fund them better. And it's one thing to have a discussion about some of the finer points, but to ignore the fact that it is very profitable to be misogynistic, and until we change that, very little is going to change. I just think we have to come to terms with that a little bit.
Thank you, Dominic.
Yeah, I agree with both the statements about education, and that's one of the most underfunded sectors or ministries in Fiji. And I think this goes back to one of the things I shared. If we have 90% of our politicians who are male, then priorities don't get set right. The social sectors are not invested so that we're able to, address not only gender-based violence, but also the health, health sectors, etc. One of the things, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. But one of the things that we see here in Fiji, but also across the world, is there's a growing investment in militarization, and not so many investment in addressing issues of gender inequality across the world as much as here in Fiji. Here, we are seeing Fiji invest so heavily into bushmasters. It's like we're going to war tomorrow with some country, but one of the epidemic that's happening right now in our country is gender-based violence. And so again, it goes back to it's a you can come to it through many points. So from the education, from the policy level, and we need more women in politics as well, and we need to create the kind of environment to support that, so that when they're in power, they're able to move some of the things that we are asking for, including reform to education, curriculum, the reform to legislation and policies that continues to disadvantage women, girls, and other gender minority groups.
Hey Todd, if I could share just one more thing that came to mind, and it's going to be a little bit of a controversial point, and I'll say that it's my point. If anyone wants to co-sign, please feel free. I've had a conversation with Alicia before on this, but this is not a viewpoint of hers. So I just want to, or Equality Bahamas. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. We have to interrogate how the church and how religion and how these various different aspects that are held within the church and religion kind of uphold some of the conditions and systems that create gender-based violence, right? We really have to start to interrogate some of those values that are held, and how we articulate those values and carry out some of those values in our society, especially when we look at this combination of church and state, and how they really do continue to sustain and perpetuate, conditions that create successful gender-based violence. So that's a point that I do want to offer, and I think once we start to interrogate that, we can really begin to, also understand how that impacts our society as well.
Great, good point. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's just, no, it's a good point. Yeah, I do want to open it up now to questions for anyone else, questions or comments from others who are joining the conversation today. And I think Alicia will be able to manage others who want to come in and join the conversation. But I don't know, so far I've learned quite a bit. I appreciate the input from all three of the panelists. So we have some time if others have questions.
We've got Natino up first, Todd.
Thank you, Natino. I'm not sure I can control it from here, or I don't know how
Natino,
to.
you should be able to, they can unmute. Natino, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
Great.
All right, good evening, everyone. So I thought the conversation has been interesting, but I think, and I was hoping that we would get to talk a little bit more, and Dominic started to talk about it. I'm not as optimistic about ending gender-based violence, because you cannot, like, when we're talking about gender is raised, right? And when we're talking about gender, we're talking about beauty standards, we're talking about standards of whiteness, right? We're talking about whiteness as a structure, right? And to talk about gender, you have to also talk about white supremacy. And in the Bahamas, I'm not optimistic about that, because we can't have conversations about white supremacy in the Bahamas, right? And it frustrates me because yes, we're a predominantly Black nation, but we have yet to unpack the 48 years of quote unquote independence where we still don't rule our own economic sector, right? And that impacts the way that we view gender, as Dominic was talking about, the profitability, right? Because if we cannot talk about how whiteness and standards of whiteness inform the way that we look at gender and reward us being misogynistic, reward us being heterosexist, then all we're doing is talking to hear ourselves, right? And I really hope that when we have, so I've been reading a lot lately, and I've been reading the work of Charles Mills, who he's a Jamaican-born American, and he talks about the racial contract, right? And he says the racial contract is a multiplicities of contracts, right? It's an ignorance contract. It's a patriarchal contract. It's a sexual contract. It's a slavery contract. It's all of these contracts into one, but it's a contract that we don't readily talk about, right? And he's talking about, or he's deconstructing the social contract of Rousseau and trying to posit a different kind of understanding so that we can understand that when we talk about the social contract, we're talking about essentially a white contract that we agree to, which is, again, the standard of whiteness. And I bring this up because, again, when we're talking about how we go about having relationships, right, and telling men how they can contribute, right? I think that we have to understand that to be a man, particularly in the Bahamian context, in the Bahamian context, is to tacitly consent to a set of ignorance about women and other genders, right? Because you have this idea, as Stephen was talking about, the man box. That man box is a box of ignorance, right? It represents a box of ignorance because there are ideas about men and you're not entertaining any other alternatives, right? And so if we're really serious about this, right, we have to deal with the epistemic violence that comes from this toxic man box that we keep talking about, right? If we're really serious about this, then we have to incentivize or think of a way, because we're dealing with capitalism, we have to incentivize actually doing the right thing in some way, or some measure of capacity. Because as it stands now, I do not think, and I was listening to the conversation, trying to just take it all in. And again, it's frustrating because as Dominic was talking about, these things can be solved within a day, within a week, right? We've seen instances of this, right? COVID-19 has made some of those realities that we thought were far off. It's brought some of them within vision of recognizing that these things can happen, right? And we've seen other examples of this when the Prime Minister of New Zealand changed the law on guns in one day or in 1 week, whatever the time frame was. These things are solvable, but the question is the political will, the incentive for us to move away from whiteness is not there. I don't see that. And I just thought that I'd bring that up because, again, I don't want us to walk away. And whenever I come into spaces like this, the complicity that most people play in their oppression, I don't think that we're willing to recognize that and give that up. Because I think that Stephen was talking about, we're not asking, I am asking you to give up that. That's a part of us establishing this new way of looking at gender. You have to give up your male privilege in order for us to achieve this. And if you're not willing to do that, we're wasting our time having these conversations with men, because they have to be willing to give that up. Because the only way that we've continued this particular system is through violence. And so giving that up is even if they willingly give that up, that's a violent internal process that they must go through, right? And so if they're not willing to deal with that violent internal process, I can't say that I am optimistic about this change, the circumstances ever changing, because we can't even have real conversations about about the intersectionality of whiteness in particular and how that informs gender and vice versa. And so, yeah, I'll yield the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Natino. Appreciate your perspective. And your passion. Are there any other comments or questions for our panelists?
Well, I just want to say in terms of that point, if I came across as optimistic, I'd like to clear that up right now. I am not. I mean, I try to be, but when I listen to radio shows like I did today, or when I hear some of the conversations, I mean, just to give you some highlights from recently, like someone in my social circle was telling me how someone came over to their house and didn't want to drink out of a glass, a martini glass, because it was too feminine. And like, this is not an unusual example. Like, there's just, because we don't have genuine definitions of maturity and adulthood, people are replacing them with these weird ideas. And I agree 100% that like, you can't discuss gender and what we're going to change about it without discussing white supremacy and the history of race and the history of how gender and white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism have all been used to reinforce these very bad ideas that are profitable to a very small number of people and a very small number of industries. And they continue to be so. And so we still have the issues. And so I think that on a macro level, that's a very long discussion, and getting into like the last 10%. I would say that one on the way to the journey to that for me is talking to people about that exact idea and getting them to see how connected they are, because starting a conversation about how gender and white supremacy and I mean, so many of our modern ideas that we think of as neutral or taken for granted were learned. And, you know, because it's specifically beneficial to the people who have the power for us to learn them that way. And it's some of us, you know, we're like the fish that can't see the water. You know, we'll take a step back and see so much of the image, but not see how, you know, like when it comes time to give up our power, when it comes time to be quiet and do what women say or what other genders say and let them lead the discussion, so many of us can't do it. And that's where the problem is. We retreat to our hierarchies and to these bad ideas because they serve us, because they're beneficial to us. And until on a personal level, we can say, I want a different world in which other people have equality, we're gonna get bad ways of reinforcing these things, whether it's, you know, someone has more money or someone has a different gender or someone is from a different country. You know, it's not a level playing field, and pretending that it is only benefits the people who are already on top.
Thank you.
Yeah, just my final thought. Yeah, I do agree with the whole, you know, white privilege and white supremacy. But in the context of Fiji and some of the work that we're doing, I'm optimistic because it has taken us so long to work on some of, you know, the work around addressing gender-based violence, specifically with persons of diverse OGS. It took us a long time to get the faith-based institution to the table, but now, you know, we are working together, and I think it was with COVID-19, they began to start publishing, you know, this was a church putting out statements that were, you know, saying that, you know, please, you know, do not discriminate persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities. And the reason for that was, as Fiji, you know, experienced one of the disasters, it was LGBTQI people who were, you know, being blamed and was, you know, they were pointed at and ridiculed and harassed and said, you know, It's because of who you are, your identity. It's because of your sinful ways that God is, punishing us. And so the church has taken a very progressive step. And so I'm optimistic about the process of engaging the faith-based institution here in Fiji. I can't speak for the Caribbean or for the Bahamas, but yes, I know that who's this? Martin Luther King reminded us, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But the question is, who is doing the bending? It's us. We are the one who's going to bend, who's going to, put that pressure there to get towards justice. It's going to take collective action. Every man, every woman, every gender non-conforming person, every person with disability to get there. And I think dialogues like these are really great platforms and space to begin that conversation and to get us there. So that's my final input. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would have to, share Lagi's sentiments as well. I do think we have a lot of challenges, putting that very lightly as it relates to the Caribbean and the Bahamas, as it relates to gender-based violence. But I do feel, I feel optimistic. I definitely appreciate, Nitino, your passion. I think, we have to come to a place where we need to have those discussions. I think because we are in a position where you and Dominic both talked about capitalism and white supremacy and pre-colonialism, but all of those things those systems that were put in place in the past and that are still held right now benefit the people that are in power. And right, so what's happening is we see it's not broken, so why fix it? Why interrogate it? If it's viewed as not being something that's an issue, it cannot be changed. And so I think what's important is, yes, definitely discussing. Oh, I apologize if you didn't say capitalism first, but I do think it's important. I do think it's important that we begin and keep having these conversations because it's going to be important, whether it relates to we start talking about gender roles, or we start talking about toxic masculinity, we start talking about capitalism and white supremacy and its history with the Bahamas. But we have to start talking about it. If we become pessimistic about it and we just say, it's not worth the time, then where does that leave us? It doesn't necessarily leave us, in a better place. And it's definitely fair to feel a little jaded and a little pessimistic, but unless we, grasp at the straws that are available and have the conversations and, provide the education, then we're just going to stay where we are. And so even if we're creeping forward 5%, 2%, 10%, over time, it's still creeping forward. And so I think that's very important to be mindful of, but it's going to be tough. And it's something that we all have to kind of pitch in on a macro level and a social level and so many different ways. Because it's not one person can do it. It's not going to be just one thing that does it. It's going to be a collective effort to get this done.
Thank you, Stephen. Alicia, I'm going to pass it over to you in just a minute, but I understand, Irene, you have your hand up, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, so hi guys, my name is Irene. I'm from Indonesia. I'm not from the Bahamas or the America. And I really agree with what Stephen said, and also Lavetanalagi, that we have to be optimistic, because I can give you an example from my country. It takes a lot of years for the Ministry of Education to finally publish a law to protect the students in the university from sexual harassment. That's one of the examples. But turns out that our voices do finally end up in the result, because we keep talking about it. We keep engaging in these conversations, maybe during the 16 days of activism, and we don't stop doing it. And finally, there is a male minister of education who has 3 daughters, and maybe because that's why it relates personally to him, because he says, I don't want my daughters to ask me, what have I done to protect them? And I don't do anything. And then he finally publishes this law which protects us from being sexually harassed in the university. So I think we don't have to be pessimistic. I think we have to be optimistic and keep talking about this until finally there is this, I don't know, like one man or one gentleman who will finally take the first step. And I think that must also start from the grassroots, like from the peers among us. Like there's this one speaker from webinar called Jackson Katz, who's the founder of Mentor for Violence Prevention. He's like from the top class of the peer status, like the athletes. And he's starting the first step because usually men will follow the other top men in the social status. And when he's taking the first step, the other men also follow and starts engaging these conversations. So I think when we keep talking about it until there's one man who's being gentle and are willing to give up their pride, just like what Ntino said, and being vulnerable, I think there will be a result. That's just what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. That's a nice reminder that, sometimes we feel helpless in combating an issue like this, but the actions of one person can make a difference. So that's a good reminder. So we're going to wrap it up now. I want to give, before I have my last word here, I do want to give the panelists one more chance. If you have anything that you want to say before we wrap up. I know a couple of you had finished up your remarks. So chime in if you have anything at the end to say.
Hey, I'll start. I just wanted to say, yes, I agree that we should celebrate the things that we have accomplished. And I don't mean to say that you should be cynical or pessimistic, just that it's important to remember that in the context of what we accomplished, that I don't want to, our standards are way too low. There are too many things that we've known for too long that we're not getting done. And I'm going to be the person who's saying that, acknowledging that throughout these things, because we know better. We have good data. We have anecdotal evidence. We have all the information in the world to do these things, and we're not doing them. And it's because it benefits the people who are benefiting. And that's the point that I think Ntino made. I don't think these things are pointless without delving into everything. But I also think that that's part of this discussion every time, that if we don't get to the root of these systemic issues, like one program, one change isn't gonna fix that, which isn't to say you shouldn't do it, for so many reasons. It can make a difference lots of times, and a lot of times you don't know which ones are gonna make a big difference while you're doing them. So and especially in terms of the cynicism and the frustration, getting your hands dirty with something small is a great way to rebuild those energy reserves, but I just, the celebrations we have are really small now. And I just want to, that's more what I'm saying, that it's important to keep in perspective how far we have to go when we celebrate. And also that I appreciate everybody's time. And this was a very informative discussion for me. So thank you all.
Yeah, if I could say anything, it would really be to kind of hold a lot of space for I think something that Irene said as it relates to optimism, because it's really going to take that one person or those few people that can get into spaces of power or be in spaces of power or encourage others in space of power that may have heard something that we said or seen some kind of statistic on gender-based violence or something along those lines, and really develop the empathy. As she mentioned, the minister has daughters, so now that becomes even more of the issue is now on their doorstep. But it's going to take someone that has that lens, that gender equity lens, in a space to be able to institute the things that need to be able to happen, right? And also to be in a space to encourage other men, other civilians, other people that don't have those spaces to also kind of follow in those footsteps. And so I think, as we continue to look at being as optimistic as we can, I also want to hold space for Dominic's comment, because we have too many and so many examples on how to do this better, right? But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you're talking to, we don't have the persons that are in positions, spaces to effect those changes that we see in other nations across the world, that we see the statistics drop because of these things happening. And so I think as we continue to try to hold as much optimism as we can, we still have to hold people to the fire because we've seen it can be done. We've seen that there are nations that are making leaps and bounds towards these issues. And so why can't we, navigate that and support ways to do that ourselves? It really is because, the people that are in the spaces to do it don't see it as something that needs to be done. Because like that's been said, keeping it the way it is benefits them.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so we're in the middle of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. It's being observed by organizations, governments around the world, including Equality Bahamas right here in the Bahamas. There are conversations like this happening globally that where ideas are being born, where people get inspired, where people develop a resolve. These dialogues are helpful. And I know I've learned some things tonight, and I hope others have too. I want to thank the panelists, Stephen Thompson, Dominic Duncombe, and Langi Rema. It was an honor. And thank you very much, Alicia, for including me in this. And I'm going to pass it over to you if you have anything to say as we wrap up.
Thank you, Todd, for facilitating this conversation with Stephen, Dominic, and Langi. Thank the three of you for coming, for agreeing to be in this conversation for you, for men, in the presence of the rest of us who are determined to eavesdrop and see what y'all talking about. Thank you to everyone who joined to help eavesdrop and see exactly what's going on and kind of, witness a model of what we should really have more of happening in less formal ways. Not that this is a super formal space, but these conversations should be happening all the time. They should be happening with your family members, with your friends, with your coworkers. Like Todd said, you could challenge yourself to just make little steps toward leaving the silence behind and actually calling things out. And I know that it can be a little nerve-wracking because once you call it out and they respond, you might have to explain why you called it out. And it means that you have to rationalize, you have to kind of explain it all to yourself first. You have to be able to verbalize why something is wrong and not just know that it's wrong and not just be something that you like learned. So I think that might be some of the hesitation in calling out. So it's good practice to be in spaces like this to hear how people are talking about these issues. And I think it's really interesting to hear different perspectives from people who are optimistic and who are not optimistic. I just had to admit to myself in recent months that maybe I'm optimistic because I've always sort of framed myself, not as pessimistic, but like a realist. But if I have to be really honest with myself, I don't think that I would do this work if I wasn't optimistic, if I didn't think that a change was possible and that we could actually imagine first something better together and create it together. If I didn't believe that, then I would just go work at a bank, I think, and not do this. And I think that a part of the thing that turned it around from me was Angelica Wallace Whitfield's street art project, where she was spraying hope as a weapon everywhere. And I think it's the only time that hope didn't seem like something for losers to me, because then the word weapon was there. And I just started thinking about how it can be wielded and how it can be used. And Dominic's laughing at me. And use it in everyday life. And I think the reason that I was sort of resistant to hope and optimism is because it seems so fluffy and useless, but it's not if you're working towards something. It's not if you have a vision and if you have people who you're working with, and if you're working to get more people on your team to move us all in the direction of this feminist, equal future. That's it for my inspirational speech. I've put lots of links in the chat for some upcoming events that we have. So tomorrow, please come back and join us for Rememorying as Method with Brendan Tynes. She's joined us a couple times before to run poetry workshops, and it's always been a hit. people who are afraid of poetry, who don't think they're writers, always come, and we're able to do something collective that feels really good and that we can look back on. Maybe I'll find the last poem and share it on our Facebook so you can have a look at what we did last time. So that'll be tomorrow, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so that's New York time. Register at tiny.cc/16days112, like the date, the first of the 12th month. Thursday, we have a conversation on community and how we can work within our communities to end gender-based violence. We have Jessica Russell, who is a therapist in Grand Bahama. We have Kaiden Regis, who's a mental health researcher in Trinidad and Tobago, and Reverend Kelly Jolly, who is a Methodist minister and has joined us quite a bit for Women's Wednesdays and different conversations as well. Saturday, we have a dance workshop with Shanae Culmer. Register for the community thing, tiny.cc/16days212. And for the dance workshop with Shanae, tiny.cc/16days412. And then next week, we have some more really exciting events, one that's all about data. As you know, every time we have these conversations, people want to know where are the numbers, how do we know this is happening, how do we know this is a real issue, data, data, data. So let's talk about that. We also have a conversation coming up about reporting. So how does the media report on these stories, and what do we need to see done differently? What are some international standards? We will be joined by Ava Turnquest, who is the head of digital at Eyewitness News, as well as Kathy Outen, who is UK-based and running the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence, which is a global initiative with journalists. And Eugenia D'Angelo from Mundo Sur in Argentina. So again, we'll be getting perspectives from different regions, getting to share some ideas and learn from each other. So be sure to check out our Facebook event page to get all the registration links. You can also find them all in one document, really easy, tiny.cc/go16. So GO16, tiny.cc/GO16. For all of the events, all of our 6 major demands during the campaign and going into 2022, as well as breaking down some of the recommendations from the CEDAW committee that the government still has not implemented. And that was from 2018, and it's about to be reporting time again. So it's time to really be pushing and having the public push for some of these changes that include a definition of discrimination against women. So have a look at all that in that document. Thank you again, all of you, for joining. We hope to see you again tomorrow for poetry, and beyond tomorrow, and even beyond 16 days, because this work is not 16-day work. This is 365 a year work. It's going on and on and on. And this is just a period for us to mobilize, for us to bring more people together to really focus, laser focus on certain issues. And the themes this year: domestic violence in the world of work, and the 30th anniversary theme, femicide. If you missed the conversations on femicide, please go and look at those recordings. They're on the Facebook page, they're on our YouTube channel, and they're also in that same document, tiny.cc/go16. Many thanks to the whole volunteer team for helping to organize all of these events. Lauren isn't here this evening, but she's been here all the other ones. So thanks to Lauren in her absence. Big thanks to Nia, who is here helping to moderate the chat and check out Facebook and make sure everything's running smoothly. And I think that is our wrap. Have a great evening. Langi, enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, and we'll see you back on Zoom at some point later this week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.